Are you curious about the mind-blowing science behind the wine you drink? Do you know what's really happening when wine and spirits age? And is there a cure for a hangover? Asking for a friend, of course. Okay, so tonight you're going to get the stories and tips that answer those questions. I'll introduce our guest momentarily. If you're watching this video on the replay, please, in the comments, type the word replay. Let me know where you're logging in from. What's the weather like? What's in your glass? You've just joined one of the most passionate groups of wine lovers who gather every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine, spirits, and beyond. I'm Natalie McLean, and I teach online wine and food pairing classes. And I am live streaming this video for the first time. It is based on a recording for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk, but I'll be here live, as they say, in the comments. So get in there. Let us know what questions you might still have, what tips or stories you're enjoying, and I'll be responding in real time. And of course, if you're here with me on the live stream, please do the same. All right, I'm just going to make sure. Yes, you're still here, Adam.
Sorry
Good.
about
Okay.
that. I am. Yes,
Thought
hi.
the internet gods had decided we were done. Okay. Now, before I introduce Adam, and before he disappears again, let me just say that one of you will win a copy of his terrific new book, Full Spectrum: How the Science of Color Made Us Modern. And we're going to touch on that briefly, but of course, we're really here to talk about booze. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know that you'd like to win a copy. I'll choose one person randomly from those who contact me. All right, back to our guest. Adam Rogers is a senior correspondent at Business Insider, where he writes about technology, culture, and the ways they overlap. Prior to joining BI, Adam was a longtime editor and writer at Wired magazine. His feature story for the magazine on the mysterious fungus that grows on whiskey warehouses won a AAAS Cavalier Science Journalism Award, and that led to his 2014 book and New York Times bestseller, Proof: The Science of Booze. The book also won a coveted IACP award for the best wine, beer, or spirits book and a Gourmand Award for the best spirits book in the United States. Adam's 2015 article, The Science of Why No One Agrees on the Color of This Dress, I remember that debate, was the second most read thing on the entire internet that year. Holy smokes. And it led to his second book, I'm assuming, Full Spectrum: How the Science of Color Made Us Modern, published in 2021. Before BI and Wired, Adam was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT, and a writer covering science and technology for Newsweek. He's also written for Alta, The Atlantic, National Geographic, The New York Times, Slate, and the Smithsonian. And he notes he may be the only journalist to have ever attended both the San Diego Comic-Con and the White House Correspondents' Dinner. What a wealth of experience you bring to this, Adam. You join us now from your home in Oakland, California. Thank you so much for being here.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it
All
makes me
right.
sound like every bit as big a nerd as I actually am. Yes.
I love nerds. Yep. Well, I'm a double geek. I love tech and wine. A former tech geek, but anyway, it's I can't wait to dive into this with you. So before we dive into your writing career in the book, tell us about the time you were at a fancy restaurant in Chicago and you were watching the much esteemed Jeffrey Steingarten. He was at another table getting particular type of wine service.
This was really formative for me thinking about wine. I think I grew up in California. My dad had become kind of a wine snob in the 80s, and so I knew the drill basically. But I was an adult. I was with a friend at a really, at the time, one of the best restaurants in Chicago, and we were very excited because Steingarten. This was when he was on like Iron Chef, I think, even. So it was a big deal. He was at an adjacent table, and he was getting the full treatment, like the way a famous food critic will get treated when they go to a famous restaurant. And we just watched him over the course of the evening, because we got a long service too, 3 hours there, of just progressively getting a wine pairing with each course, and watching the glasses get bigger and bigger and bigger over the course of the night. So that, like, it started out, they were the kind of glasses that you would have in size that you would have in your house. And then just as sort of the meal reached a crescendo, he had, I'm not kidding, a wine glass about the size of my head in front of him. And there were two of them on the table. They were just enormous. Yeah, like these giant fish bowls. And, the pour was a normal size pour. Or he was getting a little bit more, probably a pour and a half, because it was Jeffrey Steingarten. But
Sure.
But just like, it got it was almost a Monty Python level of hilarity. Like the glasses just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the chef would come out, was talking to him, and I recognized the chef too. And they were very serious. Like this was a big deal. They weren't kidding around. And my friend and I were just like laughing and trying not to embarrass ourselves or look like we were embarrassing them, because really what it was it's like, yeah, man, the show, it's the theater of the theater of wine is, to me, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, but every bit as important, as the juice in the glass. And he was getting the full theatrical treatment.
Absolutely. And so as the glasses got bigger, did Jeffrey get smaller by size, or was he starting to slump down in his chair? How did he stay sober after all that?
I never know how anybody does that on a full tasting menu. I have to tell you, I was very impressed. I don't know what his state of mind was by the end of the evening. I have to
probably jubilant or blurry.
Yes, that's right.
And we're going to get to that.
Ecstatically blurry. That's right.
Yes. Now, you were also in another restaurant, this time in New York, and you're quite the eavesdropper. How did you discover the wild science that is in winemaking through that dinner?
Reporters are horrible eavesdroppers. You should never trust us.
Nosy.
I can also read upside down. So if you have something on your desk, I know what it is.
Okay.
I know what it says. Yeah, this was when I was very youngish. I had just moved to New York. We'd only been there a couple of years, and I was happy to have enough money to be able to go out and afford, kind of cute, lovely little 1- and 2-star restaurants. And this was a place called the Tasting Room, and it was a young couple. The chef was working in the basement on all electrical stuff, because he didn't have the ventilation to use a gas, so it was like basically had an easy bake stove and a electric hot plate down there, and it was making spectacular continental food basically. And his wife was running the front of the house and was also a trained sommelier, and the wine cellar was in the loft in this tiny little space upstairs. She would have to climb up this ladder to get these really interesting, just real strange wines that she would find. And as our dessert course came, we were all really packed in too. It was a very small place. The couple sitting next to us was ordering a dessert wine, and she was running down what the options were and was talking about a sweeter wine. And the guy said, "Oh, is that a Vin du Glacier or a Noble Rot?" Two different ways to make a sweet wine. You can use Botrytis, which is this fungus that grows on the grape, makes sugar express more, so you get a sweeter thing, or Vin du Glacier, chill it so that you get a colder product at the end, all that. But just the fact that he was informed enough to know that there were these two methods, and that would have a bearing on what he would be tasting. And I don't know that he thought one tasted better than the other, but he just wanted to know. And I had always been that kind of person in bars, certainly, with wine, where you sort of look at these different colored liquids and all the different shaped glasses and wonder, well, what the hell are all those things? What are they? How do they do that? And here was this person who was operationalizing that sort of interest to make his meal better, to eat, wanted to have more fun at it. And I was like, oh yeah, man, you got to know about that kind of stuff. That's how to be an adult, that's how to be a smart adult,
Yeah, and join that almost like he was exchanging passwords to, yes, I'm part of this club, so
that's
give me the good stuff.
For sure. That's a really good way to think about it too, because it is using language to do in-grouping and out-grouping.
Yes.
And that's so important with wine, booze in general, but wine especially, where if you can have those linguistic cues, not only really do enhance your enjoyment of what you're drinking, but they also cue the people around you to where your stature and stance and positioning is in the community.
Yes, you've probably heard of this, but one of the niftiest snobby tricks I've ever heard of, because you should always use your wine knowledge for evil, is that before they even pour the wine in your empty glass, you pick it up and you sniff it and then put it down.
Just to make sure that you don't get the chlorine smell from the bleach.
Exactly. And then, of course, only an amateur needs to taste the wine. You just smell it. So anyway. Anyway, that's a different podcast. So now you had a nearly existential moment while writing the book when you were going to dive into the science of grapes. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah. So this tells on me as a reporter more than anything
Excellent.
else. So I was writing. The book divides itself along kind of process lines of stages of the process of making alcoholic drinks and wine and distillates. And I wanted to write about sugar, because sugars are basically the substrates for any kind of alcoholic beverage, because it's what yeast eat to excrete alcohol. And I was writing this paragraph, like literally sort of typing along, saying like what you would really like if you're trying to make any kind of alcoholic beverage is something that produces a lot of sugar. So a fruit would be great because it grows. You don't have to, engineer that or something. It'd be great if it grew in a lot of places, a lot of different forms. If you could mess with it as a breeder to come up with different kinds of flavors and different colors that you already knew would ferment on its own, that you didn't have to do a lot of work to ferment, that could grow alongside other crops if you were growing other crops, had a lot of juice so that you get a liquid out of it. What you would love is a grape. And then I wrote that was the end of that sentence. And then the next sentence started with, so grapes, because it was going to be like, here's what the biology of grapes are. Here's where grapes come from. Here's how they evolved. Here's the biochemistry of what's in them. And I typed so grapes and realized I had no idea about any of that stuff. I just had I knew all the wine stuff. I was like, oh crap. Like I typed so grapes and had this all in one. It was like, this just those 2 words cost me 2 weeks. Huh. So I'm like, I'm going to have to go report grape. I got to go learn about grapes. Turned out there's a whole science of grapes. I had to go learn all that. I had to go learn the biochemistry and the botany of grapes. Wow. But I didn't know it until the exact moment I knew I was going to need to know it, which, I don't know, makes me a dope, I guess. I went to go learn about grapes.
It makes you a intellectually curious person, which, thank goodness, because you can lead us all into the questions we should have asked. So if your mother wrote a book about you, what would the title be?
You want to know something funny? My mom, when I was a baby, when I was about 6 months old, my mom was in a documentary film about motherhood and feminism in the 1970s. It was 1970. Nice, I guess. Yeah, 70 when they were filming it. So in a way, there already has been that, because she did talk a lot about me, and honestly, and her ambivalence as a young mom who wanted to have her own life and career, and now had a baby at home too. It was called Sylvia, Fran, and Joy. It's not that available, but I think maybe my mom's book about me would rightly be, I think, a book about her. It should be, because she had her own thing, and still does. So.
Okay, fair enough. And I just want to know, because you're so multi-talented, if your high school yearbook had superlatives, what would you have been voted most likely to become?
A massive nerd.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah. Oh no, I pulled it off. No, not only did I win that award, but they were dead right. Yeah, no.
Well, it's good to know who you are and where you're headed. So you've written extensively about technology and science for Wired and elsewhere. How did reporting on alcohol science compare, say, to other scientific topics?
That's a fascinating question, because I really that is how I tend to see the world broadly, is through a lens, through a filter of okay, well, how can I understand how this works? And journalism and science both have a lot of overlap in their methods and in the kind of hypothesis generating, the thinking about stuff, doing research, investigating these hypotheses and testing them to see which one works. And so I tend to think about that with everything. So when I got interested in it's such a jumped up way to say this, when I got interested in drinking as a more serious hobby and pursuit, when I was in graduate school, and I didn't have any money at all, but I had a little bit, and my dad came to visit in Boston. I was at BU, and there was a bar that, this was unusual at the time, had an incredible selection of single malt whiskeys, and I'd never had them before. I made my dad and his credit card come to the bar, and we sat at the bar, and we both for the first time tried single malt whiskey, and asked the bartender, which one should we get, and he recommended a couple. We both tasted it at the same time, and we're like, crap, this is going to cost us a lot of money in this hobby over the rest of our lives. And in fact, it did. We were right. But that was the way I was always going to understand it. It's like, well, why does it taste like that? And that's when you talk about sort of at one extreme wine snobbery, and the other extreme wine writing, really good sort of writing and thinking about wine. It's all so much of it is just asking, why does it taste like that? Even if you're asking, why does the business like that? Why did that family come up as a winemaker? Why do those grapes taste good and those ones don't? Why does that region taste good? How come that elevation on the north side or on the west side of the Napa River is better than that elevation on the east? Those sorts of questions are all, why does it taste like that? So the tools of reporting about science were always for me the tools of thinking about and then reporting about wine and other booze.
Does it differ at all, other than the experiential aspect, I'm sure? But are there any differences that you see? The tools are the same. But...
There is an elemental difference, which is that the practitioners, if you're reporting on science, you kind of have there's a gross oversimplification, forgive me, but you sort of have, there's the scientist, doing the research, trying to understand something new or reinterpret an understanding, an old understanding. And then there are the people who that's going to affect, who's going to use that science, the engineers, the technologists, if you're talking about biomedicine, the potential patients, the people who want the cures. So those are sort of the what do you call those, stakeholder groups. Mm-hmm. With winemaking, with whiskey making, distilling, whichever of those fields, you have practitioners who are often not themselves scientists. So there are craftspeople in a stakeholder role too. I came to find as I was reporting that as much fun as it was to visit a vineyard or visit a distillery, that there were a lot of questions that even those people, these experts, these people making fantastic stuff to drink, weren't answered because they weren't really material. To their daily practice. Some of them were very sophisticated about the science and technology of it. Many of them were. This isn't a knock, but it's just to say that you don't actually have to know what the kind of molecular structure of various sugars are to know which one is going to work to make your wine work. But that's a thing that somebody studying wine at UC Davis might want to know.
Yes, and so much of it is bound up with tradition or generational farming. So just follow the recipes that work. Although, again, I don't mean to oversimplify it.
Yeah, it's a different, I came up academically at a moment when, postmodernism and post-structuralism were big deals in the academy. And so the idea that there are different ways of knowing something is sort of built into my training. These are different ways of knowing or understanding the same thing, the same process. And there are people who do both. You've met him and I've met him, the like very technically sophisticated winemaker or an engineer brained distiller or a chemistry brained distiller or somebody like you meet them, but you don't have to do it that way. There are other ways to do it.
Yeah, more fun too sometimes.
That's true.
So when you mentioned that certain moments at bars led to this book, you've already shared one with your father. Were there other perfect bar moments that sort of crystallized your desire to explore the science behind booze?
I did come to want to understand the experience also, and because it's fun. Mm-hmm. It should be fun, and when I made this comment, it's in the book and I've said it to people before too. I wanted to be mindful that alcohol is not a safe thing for everybody, that there are people who have dependencies on it and that it can be very damaging to people's lives. It can be damaging to somebody's life even if you don't. You can have too much of that and get into a car and it can be very dangerous. So I want to take it seriously in that sense. And I would say that the book overall, all the book sort of takes place at the moment of the first sip of your second drink. So you've had one, you're not impaired, but you are feeling differently because of the alcohol, and you have a second one and it tastes the way that moment, that first sip of that second one tastes. That's the temporal, the spatiotemporal pivot point around which the book happens, if there is one.
I love that. Yeah.
And so that was sort of made me think about, well, what are those moments? What is that moment like? What does that feel like? And I mentioned one in the book too, of being late to meet a friend at a bar on a really hot day and showing up in this bar. And it was like, when I was in Washington, not really doing that great a job as a Washington correspondent, I was very stressed out all the time. I was meeting this friend at this bar. It was sticky and humid like it can be in Washington. I was running across town, but I got there and the bar was cool because it was air conditioned. It was dark because a lot of good bars are dark. And the moment of having, getting a beer put down in front of me, of being able to pick it up, feeling the condensation on the outside of that glass and bringing it up to my lips to have the first sip of it was like, it was like bullet time in the Matrix. It was like the camera revolved around this frozen moment of perfect. And I'm not a huge beer fan even. It didn't matter what it was. It mattered that it was in this space that we culturally, that we define as a spatially contained place where kinds of alcohol are consumed.
Yeah, and you say it's always 10 p.m. in the bar, so
it's always 10 p.m.
I love that.
It's always 10 p.m. in a bar. especially airport bars where time is always messed up. It's always 10 p.m. in an airport.
Yeah, vodka, the breakfast of champions. That's a beautiful description, though, of that letting go, that breathing in, letting go. And it's like that first or second drink especially. Whew. What was the most surprising insight you discovered while writing the book? We're going to dive into the different sections, but overall, is there something that just, wow, that stays with you?
Yeah, I mean, I remain stunned. And this was kind of a thing that I came to working on that feature, that article about the whiskey fungus, even, that sort of led in most respects to the book, for how long in human culture making different kinds of alcoholic drinks was so fundamental to who we were as people without us knowing anything about how they were made. People didn't know what yeast was until about 150 years ago.
Wow.
But people have been making booze for 10,000 years. So we did this thing that we didn't. I talk about this a little bit, maybe too much, but there were these there are these religions that are now called mystery cults on the Mediterranean islands, like Minos and Crete. And I read a book about one of these about these cults that said that they were so old that by the time of the archaeological records that we have of them, those people did not know who their own gods were. Because the mystery cults were so old before that they lasted for thousands of years. And by the time the practices that existed that we have archaeological records of were happening, they were doing these practices without knowing. They didn't know their own gods anymore because they were so old. And I feel a little bit that way about alcohol, that it existed for so long that people didn't even know their own gods. They didn't know what this stuff was, but they knew they loved it, and they knew it was important, and they knew how to make it, kind of.
Right.
And it was still critical. It was still vital to who we were. Yeah.
But the why it happens, how it happens, and how we react with it, all of that we're going to dig into. Yeah, a lot of mystery still. What was the most difficult part of writing the book?
Oh man, writing books is really hard.
It is. I know. Even if you're drinking.
Yeah, I mean, I did find, ironically for this, I could, for the reporting I could, but while I was writing, no alcohol at all. Like, I'd have one sip of something, like, well, I'm done for the day. That's it. I'm out. I mean, the hard part with writing a book really is, as a writer who I know said a long time ago, ass in chair. Like, you just have to be there typing, and it's you have to do that. It's a grind.
Yeah.
And the only thing that I like writing. I mean, I do it professionally. It's my thing. But really, it was the love of the material itself that will keep you doing this. A book's, just to be super cynical about it, a book's got to be about 90,000 words. It takes like at a peak efficiency. If you're really good, you can write 1,000 words a day that you can use. So that's a long time. That's 4 months of writing. If you're writing 5 days a week, that's like a lot of time sitting in front of the same thing, just trying to make it work. And trying to write something that people will like. So when it happens, when somebody like you says, hey, that was a really good book, you're like, oh, thank God, that was worth it. Like, I'm so glad, because that's all I wanted. All I wanted was I wanted people to like it, and I wanted to, every so often, I wanted to go into a bar that I'd never been to and see it on a shelf. And that has happened. That's happened to me, and I'm like, good, that's all I ever wanted for it.
That's right.
It worked.
The top award, on top of everything else you've been, the awards you've won. There is nothing like seeing your book in a bar, is there?
That's the one, great. Man. That is the thing.
I don't know what it is, but yeah, cool. All right, so let's finally get into this book. You organize it, your book, along or according to the process of making alcohol. You start with yeast, move through sugar, fermentation, distillation, aging, smell, and taste, and then finally the impact it has on our body and brain. So yeast, I'm sure we'll start there. It's important. As you note, or as is noted, in 1996, it became the first living organism to have its DNA sequenced, and yet yeast is the unsung hero of alcohol production. We tend to overlook it. You describe it as a nanotechnological machine. What, pray tell, do you mean by that?
Nanotechnology is the idea that you can build mechanisms at the molecular level or smaller to make things, or to join molecules together and make whole products, whole substances. It's mostly still science fiction. But the thing that if we didn't know what wine was, and if you didn't know what yeast was, which, like I said, they didn't 150 years ago, if I told you that there was something that did this, you would think I was nuts. And in fact, when Louis Pasteur and others said this is what yeast did, they thought he was nuts. Because what he said is, I think there is an impossibly small, invisible, living creature that eats sugar and poops alcohol.
Yeah, right.
And so the best chemists in the world at that time looked at that as a hypothesis and said, you're nuts. That can't work. And mostly the reason they didn't think it could work was they didn't know, nobody knew, how inert chemicals could be alive. Nobody knew what the connection was. So Pasteur, in figuring out that there were microorganisms living in a beet sugar fermentation tank, which is what he was studying, and that those were not only making alcohol, but also causing this stuff to be rotten. If you had the wrong kinds of little invisible guys, you had the wrong kind of stuff at the other end. That insight was what created biochemistry, living chemistry. The researchers trying to figure out, okay, I've got these living things. They make stuff, and that stuff converts sugar to alcohol. What is that stuff? Those things are enzymes. And understanding what enzymes do in a living body, that's what gave rise to biochemistry and ultimately gave rise to biotechnology. That one insight. So that's what I mean, is this nanotechnological miracle that nature creates. Just these little guys who do this thing that is so, inimical to who we are as a culture, as a species.
Right. Absolutely. And is there sort of a mind-blowing fact you learned about yeast during your research? I mean, that's pretty mind-blowing. There's what it does, but what else about yeast fascinates you?
Well, I think for a long time people didn't know why they did it, because they do it without people being around. It's not like a bar where we go up and say like, "Hey, yeast, I'd like a beer." They do it anyway in nature, and they have since before there was fruit on Earth. Yeast existed before that. So,
wow.
Clearly yeast turning grape juice into wine is not their existential or evolutionary purpose. So you ask, well, what were they trying to do? Why do they make ethanol? Ethanol is a good way to store energy. It's a pretty complicated molecule. You can use it kind of like mammals use ATP as an energy source, or there's a reason that ethanol works as a gasoline replacement, because it's a good source of energy as a molecule.
So they were making food for themselves.
That was one of the hypotheses, right? But the other hypothesis is that ethanol is also really good at killing microbes. Right? You put alcohol on a cut so that you don't get infected. That's why we do that. So maybe it was a defense mechanism, trying to figure out
the competition. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And so there's finally, it was only in the last 20 years that the experimental methods existed to try to figure out, okay, which direction did this go? Were they making alcohol to keep it, or were they making it to diffuse it? And it was really that evolutionary history that was the first clue, which is that it kind of had to be that they were making it to diffuse it and use it as a defense, because the living inside fruit and having it build up around them. I've got that backwards. Living inside fruit and having it build up around them where it would be toxic, the fruit didn't exist yet. They were living on the outsides of things before they were living on the insides of things. So the notion is that, they were making it for energy first. They were going to use it as an efficient store of energy, and now we get the benefit of that millions of years later.
Okay. And I love this. You refer to this a few times. We domesticated yeast for our purposes to make alcohol, but yeast domesticated us. I guess we settled down. That's the beer or bread argument. Did we become less nomadic to farm to make beer or alcohol? But how did researching this change your perspective on our relationship with alcohol? Like did we domesticate yeast, or did it domesticate us?
I think these questions of domestication got much more interesting to me more broadly as we think about what the human relationship to the rest of the natural world is, and what our responsibilities to it are, whether we're whether we're allowed to do whatever we want with it, whether what kind of a steward we're supposed to be, if we are supposed to be stewards. What does it mean to farm? What does it mean to raise animals if you're going to eat them? What does it mean to change an environment where no human beings live to someplace where there are a lot of houses or a lot of buildings or a lot of cars? What are our responsibilities to take care of the planet that we live on? I think thinking about it through the lens of domestication was really important to me. Like, okay, we've changed things for sure. That's what we do. Human beings change stuff. That's one of the signal things about humanity. So when we do that, what are our responsibilities there? It's not just what can we extract out of it? Can we just pull the alcohol out? No, we've got to make sure that everything else is okay too, to do this in an ethical and a responsible way, and still get the things that human beings like and need and want.
Okay. I was also intrigued by your account of the archaeologist Patrick McGovern identifying what might be the oldest evidence of human-controlled alcoholic fermentation in China. What does this discovery tell us about the role of alcohol in early human civilization? Were they just did they just like the intoxicating effects?
Well, I think McGovern would hypothesize that it was important for ritual, and I think that it still is. These are rituals fundamentally. The going out with friends for drinks is a pretty core ritual for human culture. But I think he would say that there just were not a lot of psychoactive chemicals. There was no drug business. So the idea that there were plant-derived or other derived substances that would change the way you felt when you consumed them. This was arguably the basis for transatlantic trade in the colonial era between Europe and the Americas, that they were finding stuff like, wow, if I put that in my mouth, I feel different. Before that, the only stuff that they had were monks telling them lies about what kind of lizards to grind up that would cure your ills or whatever. And this, I think, is something like that too. That, like, for McGovern, he's got this thing. It's like, look, they were doing it even then, 10,000 years ago. They were doing it, and they didn't know how it worked necessarily, and they were combining a bunch of different ingredients that we wouldn't use as much anymore. But it was still this thing that if you and I sat down with those people 10,000 years ago, we would taste it and recognize what they were doing. That it was core, to the religion, the society, the way things function. You had to have alcohol if not at the center, at least on the table.
Yeah, I'm going to think about that when I meet friends for drinks. This is a ritual we are practicing together. I just, you don't think about that either, much less the alcohol you're consuming, but it's all of a piece going back deep into time. So the book touches on how different cultures have had different drinking patterns and behaviors. Which cultural approach to alcohol consumption did you find most interesting?
I liked the ones where it wasn't culturally toxic. There were a few.
It's a good start.
Yeah, there were a few where the expectation was that it was going to be all men and they were going to get violent. And you still see some of that in some cultures. I mean, I'm not going to name any name, but everybody can think like, oh yeah, I guess that is how alcohol gets consumed there. And the ones where it was, somewhat ritually, quietly consumed among friends to become more contemplative were the ones that I identified with. But I have a feeling that this is, as a friend of mine said to me once while we were sitting in a bar having drinks, where he said, Adam, there are club people and there are bar people, and you and I are bar people. And I think this is that coming out again. It's like, it's not so much a dance club thing for me. It is a, sit and work out the ills of the world thing for me.
Right. I like that. And then you visit, I like how you frame all these questions by visiting different people and places. It really brings the story alive. But you visit the National Collection of Yeast Cultures in the UK, where they saved a rare yeast that the Jennings Brewery lost after a devastating flood. Tell us about that. They preserved the original yeast, so they got it back. But how do modern brewers and distillers safeguard their yeasts? Is it mostly these national collections? Do they do anything else?
Yeah, and this is a divisive question, because some alcohol makers don't think the yeast is that important or not the most important part of their process. So they'll buy a commodity yeast. Then there are companies that grow up their yeast and make sure that the specific strain of yeast or multiple yeasts stays stable enough so that they know what to expect, both in terms of their productivity and also in terms of the other flavors, because they make more than just sugar. They make other stuff, and those are some of the flavors that we detect. But some distillers and some brewers and some winemakers think that the yeast is critical. They want to use a specific one, and that's especially true with a lot of kinds of beer, especially with the kinds of beers they make in England, where if you're making a lager versus a ale, there's yeasts that either float at the top or sink to the bottom, and what kind of flavors they make is critical if you're making real ale versus the crummy stuff that they would see as the crummy stuff that like a giant American or transnational brewer would make. And so if you're one of those people, if you think that your particular yeast is critical to what you make, you have to do everything you can to preserve it. So I've been to distilleries, for example, where there's a whole department that's all about keeping the yeast and then like making sure that there's one reference strain that then they grow up a little bit, but they keep a lot of the reference strain behind, because as yeasts grow, they mutate and develop and change, and you don't want it to change. At Four Roses Distillery, which makes bourbon in the U.S., the Four Roses are the 4 strains of yeast that they use. They really care about that. Some distilleries do, some distilleries don't. Okay, so like what Jennings did was the brewery was destroyed in a flood, and their yeast collection, which was the thing that they felt made Jennings taste the way it did, was gone. But they had one sample at this collection at a university miles away, and so they could go get their sample that had been preserved, in suspended animation and liquid nitrogen, and grow it up again and start making beer again. The machinery you can get anywhere. The water is a thing, but if you get the water from the same source, that's the thing. Some places will decide that their substrate is key. Does it matter which grain you use, or do you just need the same species of grain every time? All these places make these decisions, and that's what the product is. And some of them still think the yeast is important too. I happen to think the yeast is super important. I've been thinking about it a lot, actually.
Oh,
because
that must be a real strain on your mind. Sorry, I'm sure I know you like puns.
It's true. Yes, no, yeah. That's absolutely right. I went to a wine tasting that was mostly pet nats from Eastern Europe, and they were very yeasty. Yeah. And I thought they were terrible. And I it's all super subjective. I know there are people who love them. I've never particularly liked sour beers either, the beers that use the wild type yeasts. Sure. That's never really been my thing either. And so when I was like, wow, this is really a new thing, a new way for wine to taste. Didn't used to taste like that. That's interesting. It's not my thing at all. I'm going to go inside and get a totally different glass because this is not for me. But this is the yeast, coming to the fore. These are very yeast forward flavors. And it's interesting to see that. To me, I would have thought like that's the way wine probably tasted, 2,000 years ago when they were still mixing it with honey and spices before Odysseus could drink any of it. But now we're back to it.
Yeah. No, I think yeast makes a difference, and I'm always intrigued when I see on the wine label made with wild yeast, or some will have it even as their sub-label name or whatever. But I do think it makes a difference, and it can be, I don't know, whether you believe in terroir or not, more terroirish of the place if it's wild yeast from the native surroundings. So definitely, absolutely. So let's. What have different, you've noted that different yeast strains are designed to create different flavors. Some yeasts now will lower alcohol. I've heard of power yeasts that will produce turbo alcohol, high alcohol, although that's going out of fashion, especially in wine. Are there other things that new yeasts are being bred to do?
Yeah, it's a tough it's a tough row to hoe. Because wrong substrate, I know, but because of concerns about GMOs,
right? And those are banned in the EU, right?
Right. So if you're trying to make wine there, right. And they'll get mad at you if you have a genetically modified yeast. But the reason that yeast are also a workhorse organism in laboratories is that they're very easy to change traits, to change their genetics. Okay. They share DNA with each other. And they, when they grow, they tend to mutate very quickly. Like generation to generation will change. So you can use kind of classic animal or microbial husbandry techniques to change them as well, to look for particular traits. And yeah, if you want to take this is, I think, going to become especially important as climate change changes the regions that are important wine producers. As places like Napa and Sonoma become too hot to grow the kind of grapes that they grow, or as places like Australia get super hot and they still want to grow grapes and varietals that really kind of favor a cooler climate generally, or seem to do that maybe you can develop yeasts that can respond to those stresses and still produce more of the flavor molecules that you want out of those particular strains. You have to identify what those molecules are. That's a hard part. But that would be one approach. I mean, it's sort of like it's that, or Napa cedes all of its importance to Washington State, right? Like those are your choices. So.
Right. Yeah. No, that would be great if they could come up with something like that, and still to protect the signature of Napa or wherever you're talking about. Moving on to sugar. You describe sugar as the most important molecule on Earth. That's a bold claim, Adam. Can you explain why sugar deserves this title over other contenders, like, say, water?
So, yeah, sure. I mean, I'm obviously being provocative in that statement, but to me, water's medium. Water's the thing where all this chemistry happens. But the other stuff, the other chemicals, are message, and sugar especially because it has so many different functions. So sugar is another another way to store energy. It's a complicated molecule. The molecular bonds keep a lot of energy tied up in there, so you can eat it, and it gives you a lot of calories of vim and vigor for any animal, not just us. But also because it can be structural. You can assemble sugar molecules like Lego pieces to build all kinds of other stuff. One of those things is starch. Starch is a big, complicated polysaccharide. Poly is many, saccharide is sugar. But if you do a few little tweaks of those molecules, if you assemble sugar molecules in a slightly different way, you get cellulose, which is wood or the stuff that makes up plants. It's the most common molecule on Earth. Maybe this record books change. And if you assemble it again slightly differently, add a nitrogen in there, you get something called chitin, which is the stuff that is crab and lobster shells. And it's also the cell wall in yeast. Yeast have chitin, which is kind of weird that they have that. Another super common on Earth, super common molecule for life. So these are all sort of sugar and sugar derived. And even DNA, even genetic material is a sugar backbone. That's the structural part of our genetic material is a sugar.
Is that the ribose or what?
That's the ribose. Yeah, exactly. That's right. The ribose and deoxyribonucleic acid. That's right.
There you go. Okay. Yeah. All right. So we've covered sugar well enough now. Let's go on to, we'd be here for 3 hours. Fermentation. Let's get to some of the action here. Some of the oldest alcoholic beverages in history, like chicha. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Relied on human saliva to start fermentation. That just caught my eye. Like, how did that work? It's weird. Yeah.
Well, so you and I and a lot of other animals can digest starch. We have an enzyme in our saliva called amylase. The ASE is the enzyme part. The amyl is the starch part in this case. That breaks down starch into the sugars that we can digest. Yeast cannot do this. They can't digest starch. And huge amounts of the sugar in plants is locked up as starch. So if you want to take the sugar in a plant, especially in a grain, like a corn or a barley, and ferment it, you have to simplify the sugars. You got to break them apart. And there are a bunch of different ways to do that. The malting process is a way to do that. Sake and other Asian spirits use koji, use another fungus that can digest the starch, turn it into sugar before the yeast get to it. But chicha, which is a South American corn-based fermented product, the way they would make it is that basically women, because a lot of this production stuff was seen as women's work until it was industrialized, just like the rest of human industrial history, would sort of sit and chew the corn in there, like masticate it in their mouth. So the amylase in their starch would break down in their saliva, would break down the starch into sugars, and then they would kind of spit it out and make a little patty of this blue corn and let it dry in the sun. So get rid of the cooties, right, basically. And then they would use that and ferment that into the drink. I've actually never had it.
Well,
and I really want to try it because it sounds weird as hell.
It does. You need to have one of those village visits or whatever.
That's right.
Another story for your next book. And we often think of fermentation as yeast turning sugar into alcohol, but you write about the microbial terroir, which we may have already touched on. What do you mean by the microbial terroir?
Two things. Yeast make a lot of other chemicals when they in that digestive process. That transformation of sugar doesn't only create alcohol; it creates other alcohols, other than ethanol, which is the one that we think of most often, and also other chemicals that have flavors and aromas. So that what we were talking about, that yeasty flavor that a pet nat will have or that a sour beer will have, those are those other molecules making their presence known. And you can get a yeast strain that has very few of those, so you have something that doesn't show that, or you can get a wild type yeast that's really crazy and go nuts. Mm-hmm. But also there are other kinds of microbes in the environment that you can also allow into your fermentation. So this is especially true in rums, and especially true in rum agricoles. Rum agricole takes ferments and then distills clear sugarcane juice. Most of the rum, the sort of Bacardi type rum that you get at the Target or whatever, is usually using molasses as the substrate. So when you're making sugar, you get the white sugar that comes out that you put in your coffee or whatever, and then molasses is a byproduct of it. What do you do with that? Well, you can ferment it and distill it and make rum. You can also just take the cane juice and do that. But when you do, you have to go really fast because it's pure microbe food. And so not just the yeast that you want will settle on it, but other yeasts and other stuff from the environment will settle on it too. And in fact, some of them will make flavors so crazy that there are some rum makers who will actually like scrape the gunk out of the still, bury it for a while, let it grow like all kinds of weird stuff, like the blooms that, if something goes bad in your refrigerator and you're like, oh, I've got a little colony or whatever, I better throw that away. They want those to happen, and then they'll actually mix some of that back into the product. So it all gets, there's nothing toxic in it, and all the weird stuff gets killed, but you get the flavors.
Like what flavors would that blue gunk make? Would it be just sort of subtle feral underlying? I don't know what.
Feral's a good word there. Yeah. Have you ever had a rum that you describe as like funky and grass?
No, but I like that word. I can use it now. Funky.
It's those. So you taste and you're like, wow, that's got like they can be almost meaty, like they're very umami flavors, and they juxtapose really interestingly with the sweetness of a rum. And there are a few rum makers, that, especially so not the Jamaican rum makers as much, but the like the Barbadian rum makers, some of the other islands, other Caribbean rums, where you're tasting, you're like, whoa, that is weird. Like that is not a daiquiri rum. That's something else. That's like you want to make a tea punch out of that or something real. Like aggressive.
What? Sorry, a tea punch?
Tea punch is it's rum about a $50 sized slice cut out of the outside of a lime, muddled into some syrup, and then just a dollop of rum. It's one of my favorite rum drinks. They're great.
That sounds great.
Yeah,
very thunky too. Okay, so I love how the process really clarified things for me. The organization of your book. Because I focus mostly on wine and not a lot on spirits, though I'm really keen to learn. So, distillation, the way you positioned it to me, seems like it moves, a step beyond fermentation. So distilled wine gives us brandy, distilled beer gives us whiskey. And you describe distillation poetically as the apotheosis of human life on Earth. Now, what do we mean by that?
Perhaps, again, I'm being somewhat provocative when I say that.
That's okay.
Well, here's why I think that. It's one of the first, really, among the first, and it comes at a moment of intense technological development for humanity. So depending on how you believe these histories, distillation gets developed, sometimes sort of in the first 200 to 300 years of the Common Era. And it comes out of a moment when people are just becoming the engineers that we are, when they're really starting to transform naturally occurring phenomena into a technology that can exist in a temple or in the home. And distillation is one of those technologies, along with a lot of automatons and sort of everything, all of the simple machines, the gears and the screws and the steam engines and the the earliest moments of saying, hey, if I dig up enough of those really interesting dirt and cook it long enough to turn it into this really hard stuff, and combine it with, like, if I melt sand, it turns into this clear thing that's really hard. It'll break, but it's also, clear and beautiful. They're figuring out glass, they're figuring out ceramics, they're figuring out metal, they're figuring out gears, they're figuring out all of the things that are the underpinnings of the built environment today. And distillation's one of those. Distillations happens in those same labs, basically, and those same people are figuring that out too.
I love that. Just a hive of human achievement and curiosity. As you noted, fermentation would happen without us, but distillation requires human intervention. You call distillation a technology, but not chemistry. What's the difference to you?
Well, I think chemistry is something that also probably happens. You discover biochemistry. Those are processes that a human scientist can unpack and then take advantage of. Right. But in order for a distillation to happen, distillation is fundamentally a separation technology. It's like if you a strainer or a centrifuge, using gravity, spin things around. The heavy stuff goes to the bottom, right?
Yeah.
The heavy
or
stuff
evaporation.
Goes to the bottom. Yeah. Evaporation's one, right? So a still is basically using evaporation, using vapor pressure. What that means is you heat stuff, and at different temperatures, different liquids turn into steam, turn into a vapor. Mm-hmm. And what a still does is heat this mass of fermented liquid, and the lighter molecules turn into vapor first, go up the still, and then go over the top. Right. So the heavy stuff stays behind, the lighter stuff goes over. The lighter stuff tends to be the alcohols. And the first run of that is like methanol and things that'll make you go blind and kill you, and so you don't want to use that. Don't throw that away, or use that for cleaning. And then you keep the middle part, the center cut that comes out. So you have to know, in order to make that happen, you have to know how to manipulate metal. You have to know how to manipulate fire. You have to know how to manipulate cold, because you have to chill that vapor coming out over the top. You have to understand a whole lot of basic physics and chemistry, and then metallurgy and design to build this thing that becomes a still, becomes what we know as a still.
Right. Oh, fascinating. And the early distillers, the alchemists, were trying to separate the spirit or soul from an object, from its physical body. So some were trying to get gold from lead. And what was the most important thing you think the alchemists taught us?
Yeah, I always think, I love the alchemists. I think they get a bad rap. We think of alchemists as being, flim-flam guys, basically, as being, grifters, because you can't make lead into gold. But the practices that they developed, the kind of the methods, the methodologies, still became critical for chemistry and became critical for physics. Even if what they were doing was nonsense, largely. And I think, two things. One, I think it's important that at least this story of how distillation was created, it was created in a lab of a woman scientist in the sort of 200 Common Era or so. A woman named Maria the Jewess is how she's accounted for. And because the history here is so old and not reliable, did she really exist? Did she really do it? But maybe. But it's one of the stories that we tell here. That distillation was invented by this woman in her lab that she had in Alexandria. I also think, and this one's just me, I've known a lot of postdocs and graduate students and in the sciences, and they're always fermenting and distilling stuff. And I just assume that Maria was trying to distill the spirits of the fundamental gold that existed in the Philosopher's Stone or whatever, and then her students were like, "Buddy, what if we put beer in there?"
Grad students,
what do you think will happen
around the world and through time trying to make alcohol?
That's my assumption. That's my working assumption. Yes,
that's a good assumption. Absolutely. And her name goes on in one of the Olympic stills, the Bon Marie.
The Bon Marie, the double boiler, right?
The double boiler. Right.
That you you might have one in your kitchen. I have one in my kitchen, and it's also a lab. Still in labs today, it's still called the Bon Marie.
Right.
And it's named after her. Yeah. The Maria's bath.
Maria's bath. Nice bath. So I don't know. I know that distillers, they all have their secret recipes and whatever. But I think it was you mentioned somewhere where when they try to replicate a still, because they last 30 or 40 years before they sort of give out and have to be replaced, they replicate like small dents because they believe that is there any scientific evidence really that a small dent, putting it back in there, is going to affect the taste of the spirit?
No, it's one of those things that has both intuitive power. You can understand how it might be true. Like, yeah, okay, I buy that, because inside the still, as this heating process is happening, especially in the batch kind of stills that like single malt uses and craft distillers will use, where they're sort of an onion shape. It's got that like ball like this, and then the top, the tall stalk, right? So inside this part, stuff is all heating, and like the vapors go up, and then they condense on the inside of that and drip back down, and so the different shapes allow different flavors to make their way out. You can have a tall, skinny one of those, or if, a little fat one. You get a lot of oily flavors, and a little fat one because stuff stays in the bottom for longer. Huh. So sure. Has anybody ever tested it? Well, no, but commercially they test it. So there are stories about, for example, as a business, the single malt whiskey business in Scotland has its ups and downs, and in the last sort of decade or decade and a half, there was an attempt at a lot of rapid expansion to try to deal with the market in China, and they kind of messed a lot of stuff up in doing it. But one of the things that there's a famous story of a distillery that tried to expand by basically replicating the stills the exact same shape, because there's only one or two real still makers at that level, and they keep all the records. So they just built two more of the stills just down the road.
Okay.
But they got something wrong, because the stuff that came out of those stills didn't taste like the stuff that was in their original ones, and they didn't know what. They had to like change what they made, change the labeling, because it just didn't taste the same. There was something different about the location, about the stills, about how they heated them, about who touched the grain. Nobody knows, but
wow.
These little differences manifest in the flavor that you get at the other end.
Huh. Well, that's cool. And then you've noted some really weird things have been distilled. Just to finish off this, why are they distilling things like foie gras, mushrooms, and what, donuts?
Well, okay, so there's two groups here. That you do the donuts because it's just a source of sugar. I've tasted that. You're just proving that any source of sugar can be run in a still, because what we think of in the U.S. as moonshine is that like good old country boys up in the holler with their like backwoods still making stuff. That has evolved into a corn-based whiskey called bourbon in the United States. But
right.
But really, those guys were probably just distilling from white sugar, just whatever sugar source they could get, any kind of fruit, anything, just to have enough sugar that they could get enough yield off of it. So I tasted. Somebody was having fun, but they did it with donuts because they're so sugary to prove that you could do it. Tasted terrible.
Terrible. There's definitely a hole in the middle, I'm sure, with the mid palate. Yeah. Anyway,
that's right. I mean, you got a good nose, delicious finish, but something missing. But the other stuff was mostly I'm friendly with a distiller named Lance Winters. He's got a small, medium-sized distillery here in the Bay Area in California called St. George Spirits, okay. And he was doing it as an experimental process to try to understand distilling and get at kind of to use distilling for what's powerful about distilling, both as a metaphor and also as a technology, is that it really gets at the fundamental essence of something. So if you've ever had my experience of this is usually like if you have the best apricot eau de vie, right. will taste like the best apricot you've ever had.
Yes.
Like the specs for an apricot. Like the apricot that you had when you were 12 on a perfect summer day that you picked off a tree that was absolutely perfectly ripe and that you were having the best day of your life with your family, and you had that apricot. You're like, that's what a great apricot eau de vie tastes like. Because distillation will get rid of all the extraneous stuff and just get to the center of something, which is also the metaphor for distilling, right?
Right.
Well, so Lance was trying to do that with other flavors to see if he could capture something fundamental about a foie gras or about seaweed or about a mushroom. And I tasted the seaweed one was really kind of a wild experience because it was like being on the ocean.
Was it?
Tasting it was like getting hit with a wave. Like standing there and being hit with a wave. It really did that. And he knew it too. He was hilarious. He was like, "Yeah, I know. I got that one right." He knew it. So it's possible.
Wow, you could commercialize that, I think. Well, I love some ocean
It might
spray.
be. It was idiosyncratic. I gotta tell you.
Oh, I see. The consistency would be an issue. Yeah. All right, on to aging. What's happening while the spirits are changing dramatically while they're aging? What are the key chemical reactions that are happening with that barrel?
Yeah, this is really interesting, and it's something that's hard to get to the center of because the people who are the best at it keep it a secret. These are all. This is like IP,
right?
Because it's so critical to what huge companies do with their business. But so one of the things I love to do in a distillery, if I get the opportunity, is to taste the white dog, taste the what comes out of the still. The first thing that comes out of the still.
Oh, the head before
right.
you get to the middle cut. Okay.
No. Taste what they're going to put into a barrel.
Oh,
which is before
I see.
it goes into the barrel.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
Because the head will kill you. But
right.
it'd still be. I'm sure it tastes interesting. Methanol
Everything
is
for
a little bit sweeter.
research.
That's
Yeah.
right.
They call it the white dog. Okay.
In the U.S. it's called white dog. Yeah.
Okay.
Because it is everything that the spirit is going to be except the aging.
Huh.
And
All
if you first of all, it also tastes good there. It's really hot. It's super high alcohol when it comes out of the still, but you can still taste it. It can taste like, you taste like some acid, like popcorn or like, cereal, breakfast cereal flavors. Really interesting flavors that sometimes get covered by the wood. And
right.
wine has this. I was going to say has this problem too. Some people like it too, but that thing of like the classic, the over oaked buttery Chardonnay.
Yeah, ketchup of the wine world,
right?
Like oak. Yeah,
and it's the classic example of like, okay, well, I'm only tasting the wood. I'm only tasting the coconut lactones that come out of that inside surface of that new French oak, because French oak is a really oily, coconutty, buttery, like all these unctuous flavors come off.
I thought American oak was the coconutty one, but is it French oak too?
I always get this backwards.
French oak, well, in wine, it could be different spirits. French oak is like vanilla spice and sort of closer grained, whereas American oak for wine is usually sweeter, coconutty. I don't know. And then again, different woods could be imparting different things.
And you're going to be more right about this than I am, for sure. Well, I'll tell you the part of this that I was dopiest about was when you're drinking whiskey and it's that beautiful brown color.
Yes.
That's all from the wood.
Oh.
Like it is completely clear when it goes into a barrel and
the
it's brown when it
color
comes out.
too. Okay.
So color is part of what changes. And also all those flavors. And different spirits have different rules about how they age. So wine goes into new oak, bourbon goes into new oak, single malt whiskey goes into old oak. It has to have been used for something else, second fill, so they'll use a bourbon cask or a port cask or a sherry cask. And so that'll get the flavor of whatever else has been in it, because the process of aging, as the temperature goes up and down, the pores in the wood open and close. So they'll open, the liquid gets drawn into that layer, the inside layer of the wood, and then gets pushed back out. So there's this kind of back and forth process, which is why so many of the experimental attempts to accelerate that process use heat to try to cycle it faster. And it's part of why people, by tradition more than anything else, will have younger American whiskeys than European whiskeys. Or certainly the very young whiskeys that'll come out of the tropics, let's say the Indian whiskeys or Australian whiskeys, where they're just doing like 3 years of super fast cycling in and out of the wood.
Huh. Okay. Wow. And then have there been, I mean, it's kind of the perhaps secret people would love to get or master, but maybe haven't. But have there been any successful experiments done to age wine and spirits even more quickly?
I mean, it depends on what you think of as success.
Yeah. Still tastes good? Doesn't taste confected?
People do it. And there are some brands. There's a company called Lost Spirits that has a bunch of different sort of technological approaches to doing it faster. This becomes a matter of personal preference. I usually don't think it works.
Okay.
Typically, so like the classic move is for a small distillery to do a faster turnaround by using a smaller barrel.
All right.
So
More
smaller barrel
exposure.
means there's more exposure. Exactly.
Yeah.
But the problem is to me, to my palate, the problem with that is that you get all of the extractive flavors from the wood, but none of the oxidation.
Right.
So the other thing that happens over time is it oxidizes inside the barrel. So you don't get any of the oxidated flavors. You do get all the extractives. It tastes like green wood to me.
Yeah.
So to me, that doesn't work as well. But there's a business case to do it. So because they want to get product out the door. I think that's less common now than it was, when I was writing the book.
Sure. Well, they also throw wood chips into some cheaper wines just for that extraction, even faster, cheaper. So
right, tea bags full of sawdust, right?
Oh, really? Tea bags with sawdust?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really gross thought. But I guess they're competing in a certain price category, and yeah. All right, well, let's just motor through some of this because the time's flying, but this is so fascinating. Smell and taste, our most direct sense. As you say, when we smell wine, spirits, parts of our brain, dangling neurons are touching the aroma molecules. That, and it's the only part of our brain that is in direct contact with the sensory world, doesn't get interpreted by another part of the brain. What happens if we get a concussion? Why do people lose their sense of smell?
Oh, it's so weird. So that thing that you were just talking about, these afferent neurons, these receptors that are just attached to neural cables, basically neural wiring that goes up into our brain, into the olfactory cortex, the sensory part of our brain that does all the work of sorting out these molecules into what we think of as smells or aromas. All those dangly bits go through a part of a bone called the cribriform plate. It's right about behind here, roughly, kind of back there, and it's sort of like it's like did you ever have a Play-Doh thing when you were a kid that you put the Play-Doh in and you press the lever and it comes out through the front through the dye, like a dye, and it comes out as spaghetti?
Yeah, I also put the Play-Doh in my nose as well, so it's kind of the same extrusion type thing to get it out, And
if I say Play-Doh, everybody who had it remembers what it smelled like too. It's a very characteristic smell.
It's true.
So you have to imagine the cribriform plate is like that dye that extrudes the spaghetti with the neurons dangling down. And then when you have a concussion, bonks your head, and your brain, that's what a concussion is, right? All the brain stuff sloshes inside your skull with it moves like this, but your skull doesn't. Well, when it does that against the cribriform plate, it just shears all that off.
Oof. So you've lost your sense of smell, the end parts that were picking up all the molecules. Right.
They're gone. And sometimes they grow back. They come back, they reform. The brain is more plastic than people give it credit for often, but yeah, that's what happens. And then with COVID, a lot of people lost their sense of smell with COVID too, and that was because the part of those neurons all those tissues, COVID could also infect those tissues, and when could cause damage or cause them to be inflamed, so you wouldn't have sense of smell for a while.
Wow. Okay. My goodness. Okay. So let me just jump through some of these things, because ethanol is unique because it has a molecule. It's so tiny, and it can pass the blood-brain barrier, and it can trigger both pain and pleasure, as we know. Why do some people seem more sensitive to it than others? Is that, we've heard about Asian flushing, don't have the enzyme or whatever, but what is there about ethanol that different people react to it differently?
Ethanol is incredibly poorly understood compared to other psychoactive compounds. There's just not a lot of research into that. So probably because nobody's even really totally sure what brain receptor ethanol attaches to cause those effects.
So we know more about oxycodone than we do ethanol. Okay.
Very much so.
And why is that? Why don't we know more? Since we love it so much, it's a big part of our lives.
When you ask researchers who study it, they will say that it's basically a puritanical lack of desire for granting agencies like the government to seem like they're encouraging a vice, to be most sort of reductionist about it. I don't know if that's actually true, but that does seem right. Almost all of the research on the effects of alcohol is very reasonably dedicated to understanding addiction.
Right.
And that's, addiction is the part of this that has the most societal costs, so I understand it. But that's most of what's going on. So the closest that I think people have gotten in, I will admit it's been a long time, so if one of your viewers has better research on this, I want to see it. But most of the stuff that I've seen has been, it's probably like a benzodiazepine, so like a Valium or a Klonopin, that which is why you're not supposed to take those while you're drinking, because they have synergistic effects, same receptors. So like you know, 2 drinks in a Valium, you were out, right?
You're
gone. Dangerously gone.
Oh, dangerously gone. Okay.
Yeah, because they seem to affect the same receptors in the brain.
Okay.
Maybe.
Okay. Maybe. That's the con. Okay. All right. So a bit about hangovers. What is the most okay, so we often hear that clear spirits give you fewer hangovers than dark spirits. Any truth, or just old myths?
I think that's nonsense.
Yeah. We thought congeners, those things that, whatever, the byproducts of fermentation.
That science is terrible. Alas.
Okay.
I mean, it tends to be survey based, and then we don't really like congeners, anything that's not water or alcohol. But I mean, I don't know about you, but I've certainly been hungover after vodka. And vodka doesn't have any congeners; it's not supposed to.
True.
That science is really it's dicey, and it's full of a lot of cultural memes that aren't really scientific, like the thing about how people get a headache from red wine because of histamines.
Right.
You've heard that, right?
Yeah, I've heard it. Yeah.
White wine has histamines too.
Yes.
It's inimical to the process. But people will say they don't get a headache from white wine, so you think, well, I believe people are getting a headache, but so maybe it's from something else. What? Nobody knows. The same kind of goes for like, well, which congener is it? Why would you? This is along the same lines as people who say that tequila makes them angry, but whiskey makes them happy or something. You're like, well, how? You have to give me a mechanism. Give me a hint what that mechanism might be, because really the only significant, as far as anybody knows, the only significant psychoactive compound in any of this stuff is alcohol, is ethanol.
Right.
If there's something else in it, I want to know what it is, but nobody does.
Other than your own expectations of how it's going to make you act.
Very important.
Yeah, very. And to the taste, everything. There's been all kinds of studies. Dehydration really isn't it. That's another myth about hangovers, I assume.
You're definitely dehydrated.
Okay.
For sure.
'Cause
alcohol suppresses a hormone called vasopressin, right?
Right.
Okay. And that's the thing that makes it so that that's why you pee so much when you've been drinking.
Yep.
So you're certainly dehydrated, and that doesn't feel good.
Right.
But if you rehydrate, you're still hungover. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't know about hangovers either. Oh my goodness. Okay. There's so much more to do, research. So your book was published in 2014. What new developments in the science of booze have surprised you most since then?
There have been a couple of things that I thought were pretty cool. I like there are some distillers who are taking a kind of more scientific approach to developing the recipes for what they're making, that aren't in the old standard categories. So there's a team of folks who used to be in the kitchen at Noma, which was the kind of molecular gastronomy place in Europe.
Copenhagen?
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't remember where it was. So some of them have started a distillery, and it's they make a lot of weird, interesting stuff. Basing the base spirit is pasilla peppers, and then they use all kinds of herbs and stuff. And they taste really interesting. And are category defying. That's the thing that I like about them. You are like, is that a whiskey? Is that a gin? What is that? It's like, well, it's something new. They don't know. We don't know what to call it, which is fun. There's a company that a small distillery that I like for the idea of it, at least. They're mostly focusing on, I think, on making fuel now, but they take basically carbon dioxide and then turn that into ethanol.
Oh,
because it's just a right, yeah.
No,
it's a molecular, like they do the chemistry on it to make an alcohol out of CO2 that you instead of letting the CO2 go to the atmosphere and cause climate change, you take
that's a good trade-off.
Make a martini,
yeah.
So I tried their vodka a few years ago, and it was fine, but it was fun. The idea of it was fun.
Okay. And now you have said that. With all this research and so on, why do you say that people don't want to have drinks with you anymore, Adam?
So we've been talking for what, a little bit more than an hour. I don't know. You tell me if this was interesting or annoying. You can imagine it might be a bit much sitting at a bar. Be like,
and another we're just getting started.
Yeah,
order another round.
That's right. Oh, they have weird bitters. Bring that down. This has got herbs in it. So.
Yeah, so you're all about the context and everything else. So yeah, I can just imagine. All right. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to bring up before we wrap up?
We mentioned at the top a little bit about the kind of theater of it and how much fun it is, that like even almost independent of what's actually in your glass, that the fun around it, of the environments, can be so much part of the enjoyment of the experience. And I worry a little bit sometimes when I say that it sounds like I'm denigrating. I'm absolutely not. That's part of the experience. That is part of why this is so great. It's why that bottle of wine that you have at that little bistro that you find on a back street in the whatever arrondissement in Paris tastes so incredible there, and then when you get it home watching it in front of the latest episode of Reacher, it's just not that great.
Yes,
it's still great. It's still great, but that's a different kind of moment.
Absolutely.
Not putting out, I'm drinking wine in front of Reacher is one of the great life's great pleasures. But I also, there have been experiments, like great experiments, where people taste totally different things in a wine based on what color it is. Like the addition of food coloring to a white wine makes people taste it as though it's a red wine.
Yeah.
And I just think what's important about that is to make this into a totalizing experience. To not try to tell ourselves, this is the part that I think is maybe an error. People disagree with me, that the sommelier thing of like, okay, no, I'm focused in. I'm going to do the color of it, in light, and I'm do the aroma in a glass, and then I get a sip and I want to taste it on the front of my tongue and then the back, which is a little weird, but okay, fine. You get at least the retronasal olfaction of it and also the taste flavors on your tongue. And then that's it. And now I'm going to identify what that wine is and make some decisions about what the flavor notes are and whether I like it. And for somebody like me, there's more. There's more of like, well, where did we buy this bottle, and did I get it at a restaurant where they did a big show of decanting it or something? That all of those things are joyful. They're part of the fun of it also.
Absolutely. I'll drink to that, Adam. Thank you so much. Where can we find you and your books online?
Books are whatever transnational oligopoly is selling books to you at the moment are available. Amazon has them, bookshop.com has them, bookshop.org, I guess they are. And you can find links to those on my website, which is adam-rogers.net. And you can also listen to me saying outrageous puns on Blue Sky at Chetjocko, JETJOCKO.social.net. I can't remember how Blue Sky works, but anyway, that's where I am.
Yeah. Well, we'll put links to all of that in the show notes too, so if people are writing that down. So thank you so much. I mean, this is just fascinating. I can't wait to re-listen to your book again, and I'll pick up more this time. But great stories, Adam. Great research, great writing. It was worth it. All that grind, it was worth it, Adam.
Thank you. I didn't mean to sound like I was complaining about it. I'm really glad that you like the book. That's great.
Absolutely. No, from one writer to another. I know, I've been there. So, well, cheers, and I hope the next one is in person at a bar sometime, maybe.
Lovely. Thank you.
All
Thanks for
right.
having me.
All right, thanks.